Okay, so I brought an introduction for Sam, but Mark has given me a bit of a complex saying I'm not allowed to read anything up here, so I'm going to do my best to look at you while I'm reading. Maybe you're here because you know what critical race theory is, and you've done some research. You know it's a cynical ideology, and it's seeping into all aspects of our society, including the church. You know it sets itself up against the truth of the Lordship of Christ, and you want to educate yourself to be even more well-prepared for the struggle against it. Maybe you've heard buzzwords such as diversity, equity, systemic racism, decolonization, and whiteness thrown around. Perhaps you've been told you need to take unconscious bias training or racial sensitivity training at work. Maybe you have found out your child has been taught at school to recognize their white privilege or get active in doing the work of becoming an anti-racist. Or maybe you're just here because you heard there'd be free food. That's okay too. We're glad you're here. Liz has got some good soup, I was told, so. Whatever your reason for being here, could you please join me in welcoming our good friend Samuel Sey here today. Sam is a Ghanaian Canadian who, up to recently, lived in Brampton, Ontario, but has forsaken the woke white north for the cornfields of Ohio to marry his fiancée, Annie. Sam is a Christian blogger and speaker who addresses racial, cultural, and political issues with biblical theology and is committed to the instructions of James 1:19, being quick to listen and slow to speak. You may have seen him at places such as the Daily Wire. He's been featured at The Christian Post, The Blaze, Relatable with Ali Beth Stuckey, the Alyssa Childers podcast, and many other places online. You can also check out his regularly updated blog at slowtowrite.com. Would you please join me in welcoming Samuel Sey?
You know, for someone who's known me for a while, everything she said is straight off of my blog. Everything. I'm like, wait a minute, that's pretty good. Wait, I wrote that. Yeah. No. So, no, thank you guys. It's an honor to be speaking in front of you all. Thank you. Yeah, so as she said, I blog about critical race theory and racial issues and cultural issues in Canada and America. And I'm just going to be explaining in very simple terms what critical race theory is. Critical race theory is intentionally a very complex ideology, and I think it's intentionally complex because they want to make it hard for the so-called average person to be able to oppose what they're saying. Then they always say, well, you don't really know critical race theory. You don't know what you're talking about, right? Because it's very much academic and it's from legal scholars primarily. So I'll explain it in very simple terms, and I'll explain how biblically we can oppose it. Okay. All right, so I'll start with this. So last year, a Christian university in Calgary, well, supposedly a Christian university in Calgary, named Ambrose University, released a statement saying this. In February 2021, a guest speaker, this is what the school is saying, denied the existence of systemic racism and caused severe harm to those who were in attendance. We want to make it explicitly clear that these are not the views that Ambrose Student Council wants to endorse. We want to acknowledge the harm that was caused as a result of the statements made by the past guest speaker and send a sincere apology to those who have been denigrated. Ambrose Student Council is committed to increasing the degree of safety, inclusivity, and diversity that all Ambrose students have a right to. In our effort to grow, learn, and become allies for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So just to be clear, they're saying, according to the school, the speaker denigrated the students, and according to them, the speaker isn't an ally for Black people. Well, the surprise is they're talking about me. That's what I said. So the school wasn't brave enough to say the person who isn't an ally for Black people is, well, you know, Black. Now, the irony is, now look, I only say this because it's relevant to the whole issue. This is an all-white faculty, and they're saying that I am not an ally for Black people because I didn't say what they were thinking I would say when they invited me to speak. So the long story is this. I'll make it short. They reached out to me to do a talk on racism, and I guess they didn't do their homework. They thought, well, here's a black man. He has to be against critical race theory. So, I just went there, and I knew it was a liberal school. They claim they're Christian, but I know they're LGBTQ affirming and all that stuff, so I knew they were liberal. So I actually thought I delivered a fairly soft critique against critical race theory. Now, I didn't necessarily say, I was honest about how bad critical race theory is. But I could have really shocked them with my words. I would say true and biblical words, but I chose to be fairly gentle. In my talk, I simply explained, I will say some of the things that I said in my talk with them, but I simply explained how the concept of systemic racism is unbiblical and it's not true in Canada or in America. And at the end, I asked all the students who were there, if a single one of you can give me just any evidence of systemic racism in Canada, just raise your hand. I've asked this question to maybe now thousands of people in all my talks. There's never been a single person who's been able to give me any evidence for systemic racism. So I said, guys, don't be afraid of me because I'm black. Even if you're white, you can disagree with me. Just feel free to share your thoughts. They didn't. Well, about a month later, in March, they invited me to speak for Black History Month. So, and then they attacked me for speaking out, I guess, against what they believe. But yeah, so then around March, I think that year, last year, they released a statement denouncing me. And what was going on behind the scenes apparently is that they had two students who complained that, now, these students are actually not black. They were complaining that I was attacking black people because I don't agree with critical race theory, or especially the most fundamental concept of critical race theory being the idea of systemic racism. I'll explain what that really means in a second. But the point here is, what is it about critical race theory that would make a so-called Christian school denounce a black person for not agreeing with them? Because again, they were saying I was supposedly denigrating the students, which I wasn't. They were saying I was basically not an ally for black people. They were saying that I was denying racism, which I wasn't. They were really attacking me because I wasn't agreeing with them. And they claim, because they agree with critical race theory, they are allies for black people, and I'm not. So, I've mentioned one term that many of you guys are already familiar with, which is systemic racism. But many of you have probably also heard of things like white privilege, right? You've heard of anti-racism, racial equity, diversity and inclusion, implicit or unconscious bias, social justice, white fragility, deconstruction, and of course, Black Lives Matter. All these things are very much tied to critical race theory. But although we're very familiar with these terms, many of us don't really know the history behind it, nor do we know what they really mean by these terms. And just to give you an example, how many of you have heard of Bill 6-7? Okay. So for those of you who don't know, the Ontario government, it was originally introduced by an NDP MPP, but the Ontario government, our so-called conservative government, introduced this bill, which would essentially make critical race theory a fundamental aspect of our educational system. Now, as I will show you guys later on, critical race theory is already very prominent in our public school system, very, very prominent. And yet they want to make it even more prominent by making it essentially, again, an essential, fundamental part of our school system, from kindergarten all the way through university. So I mention that because there is an MPP. He is a member of the new Ontario Party. His name is forgetting his name actually right now. His name is Rick Nichols. Yeah. So it's funny. I had a talk with him. I'm gonna have a talk with him tomorrow, and again I'm forgetting his name. So what happened was he voted for this bill. And then he later wrote an article saying he had no idea what he was actually voting for, right? So here is a politician, right? Now, he's a great man. I had a good talk with him. He's a very humble man. He knows he made a big mistake. But even a politician didn't know what he was really voting for. He heard the term anti-racism, equity, and to him it's like, yeah, I'm against racism. I want equity. But yet, he was voting for something that when I explained to him what it was, he was horrified. So if a politician doesn't really know what this is, many of us, I'm sure, don't know either. So I will explain a little bit the backstory. I won't go into too much detail. If you want me to, you can ask me questions about it later on. But I will explain the roots of critical race theory and how we got here. And then I'll explain in maybe more detail what critical race theory really is right now. So critical race theory really starts with Karl Marx, right? Many of you guys know critical race theory really as just cultural Marxism. But we have to understand what Marxism really is. You have to understand the essential doctrine within Marxism to understand what critical race theory really is. By the way, I talk very fast sometimes. Am I talking very fast or? You're used to it? Okay. But if I do, let me know though, still. Let me know. Okay. So Marxism is primarily it's a philosophy, but primarily it's an economic idea, right? It's dealing mostly with class. But the key doctrine from Marxism is something called conflict theory, right? Which basically says this: society is made up of an essential conflict, all society, right? But Marx said that conflict is class. So I'll read to you, for example, from his book, The Communist Manifesto. Marx said this. He uses, well, he wrote this a long time ago, and it was translated in English, but very old English, so bear with me here. He says, "The history of all society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman. In a word, oppressor and oppressed." He continues, "Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat." To make it simple, the bourgeoisie basically is the upper class, right? They owned the factories, and they were basically the privileged or the wealthy in their society. The proletariat would be the poorer class, right, or the lower class, right? So he's saying that all society is really made up of the rich against the poor, and that the rich, just by being rich, is oppressing the poor, and the poor, just by being poor, is a victim of oppression. So just remember, the conflict theory from Marx was really saying that there is a class struggle. And him being a false prophet, he said that eventually their proletariat, the poor class, would have a revolution that would they would gain class consciousness, basically saying that they would gain, they become aware, or as people say today, woke. So these ideas are just not new at all. That they become woke to their oppression, and then they would be able to topple the privileged or upper class, and then have socialism and communism, and basically have an economic kind of utopia, which of course didn't happen, right? Marxism and communism actually destroys all people. It hurts the rich and it hurts the poor. It makes the rich poorer and it makes the poor even poorer, right? Nevertheless, that was his idea. So it's mostly a class struggle, a class conflict. So that's really, in many ways, half of what critical race theory is based on. Critical race theory is based on this conflict theory, although it moves it to a different direction, which I will mention soon. But before I do that, critical race theory is basically a race-centric version of Marxism. However, it's also a race-centric version of postmodernism. Now, it's very broad and difficult topic. I can spend a whole hour explaining what postmodernism really is, but very briefly, many of you are familiar with, the idea that postmodernists believe that there is no such thing as truth, right? But it's not really just that. What they really believe is essentially rich white men. Every postmodernist is a Marxist, right? But they're moving it away from just the economy into just a broader culture. So what they believe is rich white men have manipulated the whole world into believing that there's something as truth so that they can benefit white people. That's really what they're saying. So for example, they would say there is no such thing as gender, right? So you guys know this week, I'm forgetting her name, but the nominee for, Biden's nominee for the Supreme Court in the US, she was asked, what is a woman? She couldn't answer that. Why? She's a postmodernist. In their mind, there's no such thing as gender because they believe that rich white men or Western society has manipulated the whole world into believing what we think is objectivity, what we think is truth, is really just oppressive ideas to harm women, to harm black people, to harm indigenous people. That's their belief. So all this stuff that we're seeing today is really just postmodernism. So again, they say things like, there's no such thing as a woman. There's no real way to define what a woman is. There's no such thing as gender. There's no such thing as truth. Also, they say, well, what we think is justice isn't justice. What we think is equality isn't really equality. What we think is democracy isn't really democracy. And that's all because they reject Canadian values because they think, again, it's built by white people for white people. And the end goal really for them is communism. So critical race theory is based off of these two ideas, Marxism and postmodernism. So they're against things like, so they would say things like even religion, right, or especially Christianity. Well, it's built by white people to manipulate non-white people so that they can dominate. So for example, they would say that Christianity has been used by white people to deceive Africans and black people into allowing themselves to be slaves or even through segregation. Because unfortunately, a lot of the slave owners were Christians, right? A lot of the people who were for segregation were Christians. So they claim the real reason why these things happened isn't because of sin, or at least mostly sin. They would say, well, it's because white people use Christianity, claiming it's true, to manipulate and indoctrinate people into allowing themselves into thinking that Christianity is actually good instead of being oppressive. They're against things like capitalism, right? They say that, well, white people have been able to manipulate non-white people to thinking that capitalism is really just a free market system. But they would say it's not a free market at all. It's actually just, again, a way for them to manipulate all these groups into thinking that they really have a fair shot. They don't really believe that capitalism is actually for all people. It's all just, again, indoctrination and manipulation. They believe that, now again, this is all postmodernists and Marxists right now. They believe that that Christianity, our political systems, democracy, they believe that our economy, our entire culture, our values, our founding principles in Canada and America are all oppressive, especially against non-white people. Now, what's the point of all this? Well, to make it very simple, what they're saying is this. Canada, our founding principles, our Charter of Rights and Freedom are all white supremacists. This is what they believe, that due process is racist. Liberalism, now, I mean liberalism in terms of democracy, not so much the political view, right? Just Western society. They say it's white supremacists. They say Christianity, white supremacists. They say basically everything that we would consider Canadian, or our founding principles, all of these ideas are really just manipulative ideas to benefit white people at the expense of non-white people, or even in terms of feminism, to benefit men instead of women, or all people. Okay. So these are all the ideas that have benefited, all the ideas that have contributed to critical race theory. So as I said, just remember, critical race theory is basically a race-centric version of Marxism and postmodernism. So they are against, so hopefully now you understand that they are against our political system. They're against what we consider justice, right? What we say is justice, they say it's actually injustice. What we say is the truth, they say no, that's a lie, to manipulate us into thinking that these things are actually true. But concerning white people, now unfortunately guys, it's open season on white people right now. You guys are the problem for critical race theorists. They believe that white people are naturally and socially inclined to racism. So for example, I will read a quote from Robin DiAngelo. She's the author of White Fragility. And I'm guessing, frankly, if many of you women probably have received and have been pressured by some of your friends maybe to read the book. Am I correct in saying that? No? Okay, maybe you guys live in a very good area then. Because it's very common. I received so many emails from people telling me all their friends, these I guess would be middle-class white women and living in the city and everything else, and they're all reading this book. White Fragility. Yeah. Now, this book is the best-selling book on racism over the last 3-4 years. This is what she says. A positive white identity is an impossible goal. White identity is inherently racist. White people do not exist outside the system of white supremacy. In other words, if you're white, you are a white supremacist. If you're white, you are racist, and you can't do anything about it, right? That's their view. That's what critical race theory teaches. Now, critical race theory, as I said, is really based on Marxism and postmodernism. But in terms of how, despite the influence, how it actually really originated, besides those two things, is that in the 1970s and 80s, a lot of black American lawyers, including some white, Asian, Latino lawyers too, in the Ivy League schools in America, they, through their Marxist and postmodernist framework, they created this movement, critical race theory, to say that America's legal system and culture, including Canada's legal system and culture, is racist, all right? That's how it started off. And their argument was, again, that Marx was saying that the essential conflict in society was a class struggle. But they say, no, the essential conflict is actually race. So they're switching off from the class struggle into a race struggle. So therefore, as a black person, I'm supposed to see you guys as my oppressors. And then as white people, you're supposed to see me as a victim of your oppression. Which is why they say that a positive white identity is impossible. Now, what that also means is a positive black identity is also impossible. Because if I'm simply an oppressed person just by being a black person, they're telling me I can't really have a positive identity as well. Okay. Now I'll explain some of the terms from critical race theory that many of you have heard, but maybe you may not understand what it's fully saying. So the most popular term right now for critical race theory is the word anti-racist or anti-racism. Now, the word itself simply sounds like, yeah, you're against racism. Sounds simple. But no, I'll say it's actually racist. What they really mean by anti-racism is actually pro-racism. So for example, I'll read I'll read a quote from a very popular book. Now, this book is titled How to Be Anti-Racist, right, by Ibram Kendi. Now, I think the better title is How to Be Racist, right? Because just wait till I share more of what he says later on, but this is what he says about anti-racism. Racism is a marriage of racist policies and racist ideas that produces and normalizes racial inequities. Racial inequities is when two or more racial groups are not standing on approximately equal footing. And a racist policy is any measure that produces or sustains racial inequity between racial groups. Now, how many of you know what he's talking about? He's saying a lot of nothing there. That's because with their framework, with their thinking, it's very hard for them, and they don't want to really be simple. As I said, they intentionally make things complex. But basically what he's saying is this. Racism is whatever black people say it is. It's as simple as that. That's really what they're saying. They're saying the authority on racism or justice isn't God, it's black people. So for example, critical race theorists have, or postmodernists also, have a term called microaggression, right? So if you guys were to come touch my hair, right, you said, wow, Sam, I like your hair. I would say, well, thank you very much, I like it too. But if I just happen to be offended by it, right? And I say, what you've just done right now is racist. You cannot tell me that, no, that's not what you meant. It doesn't matter. If I say it's racist because of my lived experiences as a black man, and since you as a white person can't have a positive white identity, you can't say, but that's not what I meant. It doesn't matter. You are naturally racist, so everything you do is racist. Everything. So again, then God is no longer, or Christ himself is no longer the only authoritative, inerrant, inspired word on racism. I can be. The problem is, well, as a black person, of course, I can be wrong on anything. As a human, as a sinner, I can be wrong. But critical race theorists basically are saying that if I say something is racist, then it is a fact. But of course, that's not true. My point there is, the only thing that we can trust as being always correct, always right, of course, is the word of God. Okay. So, so he's saying there that whatever I say is racist, and you cannot challenge that. If you do so, then you're showing if you challenge me, if you defend yourself from a racist accusation, you're showing your white fragility. That's where that term comes from. You're fragile. Because if you weren't fragile, you would say, you know what? You're right, Sam. I, as a white person, should do penance for the rest of my life. I'm mocking them for that, but that's basically what they're saying. Okay. What he's also saying there is this. He mentions racial inequities, right? What that basically means is this, racial disparities. So what he's saying there is, if there is a racial disparity between white people and black people, or white people and indigenous people, that's evidence of racism. So for example, for a lot of us in Canada, we think that a lot of the racial disparities are only happening in America. That's not true, right? We actually have about the same kind of racial disparities, or even worse here in some cases. So for example, in Toronto, black people make up about 12% of the population, I think 12%, yet they make up 70% of the police shootings. That's a huge number, it's a huge gap. Or across all of Canada, black people make up only about 4% of the population, but we make up about 11% of the people who are in jail, right? That's a huge disparity. They say that there is evidence of racism. Well, the problem with that is this, that's illogical, right? So for example, no one would say that society is actually oppressing men. No one would say that. They would say the opposite. They would say that society is oppressing women. But here's the issue. The people who commit most suicides in the world, men. Most people in jail, about 90%, are men, right? And when it comes to education, actually men are now behind women when it comes to graduating from high school and university or college. Is that evidence that society is oppressive against men? Of course not. There are several factors that lead into disparities. In fact, as Thomas Sowell, I don't know if you guys know him, but he's one of my heroes, and he says this, it's just common sense, but he says this, even in a household where you have siblings raised by the same parents, the children will not have the same outcomes. They won't, whether they're black or white. So that's even for a household. Now imagine putting millions of people together to say, wait a minute, one group has this outcome, the other doesn't, therefore as evidence of racism. It's illogical. But like I said, their focus is not really on equality. And I'll explain what that is in a second, but their focus is on equity. Equity is essentially equality of outcome, which means they want to produce communism and socialism, not real justice. Now, look, there is, of course, a real problem with disparities in America and in Canada especially. Now, I think there's nothing wrong with that being addressed. The problem is we are focusing on the wrong problem. A lot of people hate this, and this is where it really frustrates me when it comes up and people get upset about it. And they think they're helping black people by dismissing this. But this is the issue. Canada and America have very different histories, right? We were the end of the Underground Railroad. Martin Luther King Jr., he came to Toronto in the 60s, and he said that when the black slaves would sing about paradise, they were singing really about Canada, because that was where the land of freedom, right? Now, critical race theorists wouldn't really want to remind you of that today. But I mention that because we have very different histories. We had slavery here as well too, but not anywhere near the same as it was in America. Now, some Canadians boast about that, thinking, yeah, we're not as bad as the Americans. Frankly, the reason why we didn't have slavery here is because it's hard to pick cotton in the snow. Let's be honest here, right? You know, the reason, I mean, even in the northern states, they didn't have slavery there as well too, because you had snow there, you had, weather there. I mean, it's different weather. We're not better, we're all sinners here, right? In fact, you had many black people who owned slaves too. They probably won't tell you that, right? The whole slave trade is called the slave trade because Africans sold some of my ancestors to the New World. And then even in the US, believe it or not, about 25% of freed black people own slaves. 25%. Right? The slave trade was more of just sinners trading other people, in the beginning anyways, than racism. Racism became what they used to justify slavery. It wasn't the original reason for why a slave trade started. Because unfortunately, as we know, slavery has always been around from the very beginning, or almost the beginning of the world. Okay, now I forgot where I was going with that. I went off on a tangent there, but
biggest problem.
Yes, thank you for that. Yes, yeah. So the real problem is, again, it's not racism at all, because again, as I said, America and Canada, we have different histories, but yet we have very similar outcomes when it comes to disparities. So what's the real problem? Well, the real underlying issue for both nations when it comes to black people, and this is very personal to me, is fatherlessness. That's the issue. Look, if you compare fatherless black children to fatherless white children, the outcomes are actually identical. They won't tell you that. If you compare black people who grew up with fathers in the home to white people who grew up with fathers in the home, the outcome is also almost identical as well. That's the real issue, right? So me as a black person, for example, I knew from an early age that the biggest issue that I was gonna have to overcome, and many people do overcome it, of course, right? And I say by the grace of God, I've been able to overcome some of the challenges. But my father left my family before I was born. If my dad walked by here, I would have no idea who he is, right? And he wouldn't know who I am either. I mention that because here's the problem. He's not in my life at all. He's not in the home. My mom, being an incredible mom, godly mom, works 2 jobs to take care of me. Well, what does that mean? There's no father in the home. There's now no mother in the home as well. Now, as early as 5 years old, I become exposed to certain things I shouldn't have been exposed to. And then at 5 years old, I'm committing sexual sin, right? I'm not saying that for no other reason than it's because that there affected me big time. And then my life gets worse in the sense that school, high school dropout. I was in about 25 fistfights before I turned 18 years old. If it wasn't for the grace of God in saving me when I was 19, I would have probably been in jail. I was doing a lot I was almost removed from home. I was an at-risk student. All these things are very common with fatherless children. Now, of course, not every fatherless child will go through that, right? But for many fatherless kids, that's what happens. But that's not being addressed. In America and in Canada, that's the real problem. In America, you have 75% of black kids being raised without fathers in the home. 25%. Now, the number for white people is actually 25%. That's the real disparity. You have a 50% gap in that. Of course, that will have an effect in everything else. In Canada, it's very similar here as well, too. In the UK, it's very similar as well, too. That's the real problem. But nobody really cares enough to address it. Our society says how they're really, allies for black people. If they really were, they would address that problem, but they're not. I mentioned earlier about equity and what equity really means. So equity sounds like equality, but it's not, right? Equality essentially means equality under the law. As I said, equity is equality of outcome. It's very different. So I'll read a quote again from Ibram Kendi again, the guy who I said, the better name for his book is How to Be a Racist, not How to Be an Anti-Racist. Let me explain why. And again, he is right now the leader really for a lot of critical race theorists. He says this: if racial discrimination is defined as treating, considering, and making a distinction in favor or against an individual based on that person's race, then racial discrimination is not inherently racist. Did you guys catch that? I read it again. If racial discrimination is defined as treating, considering, or making a distinction in favor or against an individual based on that person's race, then racial discrimination is not inherently racist. The defining question is whether it's creating equity or inequity. If it's creating equity, then it is anti-racist. If it's creating inequity, then it is racist. What he's saying there is this: racism is okay if it leads to equality of outcome. So if you don't fully get it yet, well, he continues. The only remedy for discrimination, sorry, let me say it differently. I missed one word here, so I'll read the whole thing. The only remedy for racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. Again, the only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy for present discrimination is future discrimination. Essentially, he's saying, because society was racist against black people in the past, now we should be racist against white people today. That is anti-racism. That is equity. So what does that look like? Well, there are too many white people at a job. Let's get rid of them so we can have more black people there, because that would be anti-racist. There are too many white people going into certain programs in school. Let's get rid of them so that we can have more black people coming into the school. That's racist. But again, in their mind, it's anti-racist. So to be anti-racist is really to be, of course, racist. Well, Satan, of course, is not going to appear as a demon or as the devil himself. He'll always appear as an angel of light. And that's what critical race theories are. And that's why they're saying they are anti-racist. Let's face it, if they came out and said, you know what, yeah, we are racist, it's very easy then. You guys wouldn't have me here, right? You would know, yeah, they're racist. But if they say they're anti-racist, then they're much more believable, and people are not going to be willing to dig into what they're really saying. So that's what it means. That's what equity means, right? Or racial equity means. And then you have systemic racism, which basically is the summary of all of what critical race theory is. What they're saying is our values, our systems, our cultures, everything that we value in Canada are meant to keep white people on top of everyone else. It's meant to benefit only white people at the expense of others. And then you have the idea of white privilege, which basically says this: since we are systemically racist in their mind, since Canada was built for white people, they try to define in their mind the practical ways that Canada benefits only white people, right? So for example, things like some of our phrases, black sheep. They will say, well, see, these are just some of our words, some of our phrases that is going to privilege white people and shame black people. Now, of course, the reason why we say things like black sheep, and my friend here, Matt, is a farmer, and I remember being at his farm, and I'm like, there's the black sheep. Well, the reason why we've made that a phrase is because it's uncommon, right? That's the whole point. It's not meant to actually attack white people. So when people say that, well, you're the black sheep of the family, they're not saying, well, you're as uncommon as black people. It's because black sheeps are uncommon. That's why we use that phrase. They don't fit into the whatever environment they may be in. That's the point. But they say again that is an example of white privilege. Things like even socioeconomic disparities. Things like they would say, as a black person, whenever I see a cop, in their mind, I'll be afraid. Now, actually, I'm not afraid at all. But they would say that a lot of black people have to walk around always being afraid that a cop won't shoot them. And those are that white people will never have to fear that. Right? They say that's an example of white privilege. Even things like what you see in the media. They'll say that when you watch TV, you see mostly white people, and that's evidence of white privilege. Well, if you're logical, you say, wait a minute, most Canadians are white. Therefore, most people on TV will be white. I was born in Ghana. I never thought that I'm going to be seeing mostly white people in my Ghanaian TV shows, right? And it's the same here. But as postmodernists, they're illogical, and they are trying to use whatever they can to make their claims more legitimate. And then you have the term, now, as I said, I speak very fast, and sometimes I have trouble with certain words, so I'm going to slow down here to say this word. Intersectionality. There we go, nailed it. In some ways, this is probably the most increasingly dangerous idea within critical race theory. I've mentioned how bad equity is, I've mentioned all of that, but this might be the worst. Because basically what it's saying is this: there is a hierarchy of victim groups in our culture. It's more complex than that in some ways, but generally that's what they're saying. To explain that, basically it's this. There is an article from a very popular black magazine called Roots. And this is actually, what I'm going to read to you is the title of this article. The article says this, or the title is this: straight black men are the white people of black people. Yeah. Straight black men are the white people of black people. See, what they're saying is this: because you have a hierarchy of victim groups, right, or what I call the oppression Olympics. I didn't come up with that. It's a common term. It's that, so they would say that black people are oppressed by white people, but gay black people are more oppressed than the average black person or the straight black person. They would say that straight black people actually oppress gay black people. Therefore, straight black people are the white people of black people. Because remember, the worst thing you can be is white. So that's why they make that claim. So the problem with that is this. Well, it's only making us even more divided. It's bad enough that they're saying there is actually a conflict, just a natural conflict between white people and black people. But now they're saying there is a conflict even within white people, black people, women, all that stuff. Because now, as you're seeing in our culture, transgender women, just men pretending to be, women. I'm not trying to be harsh there, just the reality. Now they're pitting it's an awkward term, but they're not women, but let's just, for sake of making it simpler, men pretending to be women, so-called transgender women, they're now pitting them against women, which of course, as many of you probably know, the Leah Thomas issue, right? And that's all within critical race theory. It's all within the term social justice and all of that. And it's only going to make our society worse. I don't know how long I've been speaking for, but I'm almost done. And sorry?
That's what Mark always says.
So I've tried to explain this as generally and simple as I can. I don't want to be too technical with a lot of the words and history and everything, but this is generally what critical race theory is. Now, in many ways, some of you might think, well, okay, that's good to know, but what does it all mean? Well, remember I said earlier, there's a bill, Bill 6-7, that's about, it's some pushback now, but it was already in its second reading. Only one MPP voted against it. And if it passes, it will be, again, a fundamental element of our system here, educationally, in Ontario. But here's the shocking part. As I said before, it's already been a fundamental part of our curriculum already. So I'll read to you a quote that a lot of kindergartners in Ontario are repeating to themselves, because I have internal documents teachers have sent me, where they're being pressured to have kids repeat these words. These words are from a book called The Anti-Racist Baby. It's by the same guy that wrote the book, How to Be Anti-Racist. Okay? This is what it's saying. Anti-racist baby is bred, not born. Anti-racist baby is raised to make society transform. Babies are taught to be racist or anti-racist. There is no neutrality. Take these 9 steps to make equity a reality. Confess when being racist. Grow to be an anti-racist. 5-year-olds across Ontario are repeating this. I also have a lesson plan for grade 7 and to grade 9. And this is what it says very simply. It encourages teachers to say this: race is an important part of our identity. See, the problem with all of this is that many of us are aware that movies, universities, as I said before, Christian universities, churches, and believe me, churches are teaching this stuff too. I've had many Christians, so-called Christians, call me an Uncle Tom. Say that I am not an ally with black people, because I'm saying, no, guys, the Bible is against this stuff. Trust me, it's everywhere. It's dividing families, it's dividing parents, it's dividing friends. I've seen it in my life, I've seen it in people's lives too. It's dividing marriages, it's harming our society. Even something like this, the convoy, for example. You guys know that critical race theory was actually a major part of that? When they said that it was white supremacist, people didn't understand why they were saying that. Remember what I said? They think our values are inherently white supremacist. So freedom convoy, well, freedom is a good thing in our society. They say no. What we call freedom is actually a cover for white supremacy. That's why they were saying it was white supremacists. Even though you had black people there, you had many non-white people, many non-white people there, including many of my friends there, it doesn't matter. Those people were not allies with black people. Because again, freedom is white supremacist. So even to make it even more clear, Trudeau, I know he's very popular here. No. Trudeau's federal program, he has an anti-racist federal strategy, which is costing us millions of tax. I think it's about 20 million he's spent on this thing. And there is, I think our military, there were courses that they were taking for diversity, inclusion, all of that, but really just critical race theory, and they were leaked. And they said, this is again, from the government, from our government, freedom and individuality are examples of white supremacist culture. That's why, again, at the convoy, they were saying they were white supremacists. If you weren't aware of this, you won't know how to defend that when they say, well, they're white supremacists. You will say, well, why are they? Well, they're not saying anything racist. Well, it's not about that. It's about their beliefs, right? One of the things that troubles me a lot with this is, look, obviously there is real racism in our world. Of course there is. I've experienced it. But I'll tell you guys a story, and hopefully it'll help you understand why this is so dangerous. Many years ago, I was walking in a tunnel. This is a dark, cold tunnel near my area. It was just me. And then as I'm almost midway in this tunnel, a small white girl is walking towards me. As soon as she sees me, she gets terrified. And she clutches her purse. She goes very close to the wall, very dirty wall. But I guess in her mind, that dirty wall was better than being close to me. And then she just speed walks right past me. And as I'm walking, I'm thinking, man, of course, another example of racism. Then I thought, wait a minute, let me think more about this. Then I thought, what does God call me to do here? I'm supposed to hope all things and believe all things, right? And I thought, I have a little sister, and I've said to my little sister, be careful when you're in this tunnel. Be careful. Then I thought, if this white girl was black, would I have assumed that she was being racist? I wouldn't have. And here's the irony. I don't know if she is racist. She might be, I don't know. But I know for a fact there was one racist in that tunnel. It was me. I assumed the worst of her because she's white. See, here's the issue with critical race theory. The racists are not being called to repent. But the people who are not racist are the ones who are being called to repent. That is dangerous for society. Very dangerous. Biblically, racism is simply prejudice. It's simply partiality against someone because of their skin color. That's all it means. If I show partiality against someone because they are white, it's the same as them showing partiality against me because I'm black. If I show partiality against someone because they are short, it's just as bad as being racist. Racism is not a unique sin. It's not. It's just partiality. The problem is we are not submitting under the authority of God. We're submitting under the authority of leftists and some woke black people who do not care for God. Now, of course, it's not only black people who are critical race theorists. In fact, I would say the most dangerous critical race theorists are oftentimes white people. And that's not me being racist. That's just me saying the person who said those words before, Robin DiAngelo, she's white. She's the one that said it's impossible to have a positive white identity. She's the one that said that. It's very popular for people to use the issues in our culture that are affecting black people and white people for gain. And I'm hoping that hopefully as you're more informed now, as parents, as Christians, as church members, as just average Canadians, that you be praying for our country over this. You be praying for our government. Because I had a talk, like I said, with Rick Nichols, and it was very encouraging to me. He admitted that he didn't know. Well, he won't know. Many guys like him won't know if we are not aware of what's going on ourselves. So we can pray for them, and that we can challenge them to say, hey, be aware of what you're saying. If you have your kid in the public school system, and I'm guessing many of you probably don't here, but if you do, be aware of what they're being taught. They're being taught to hate themselves, whether they are black or white. Because critical race theory is teaching black people to hate themselves. I'll just say this. This is something that a friend of mine said. Critical race theory teaches people, or black people, to say, and it's true, I heard it too when I was growing up. If you're a black person in Canada, you have to work twice as hard as white people for you to succeed. Well, what does that do? He said to me very frankly, I don't want to work twice as hard as somebody else to succeed, so I just won't work hard at all. I won't. I had the same thought too, and that harmed both of us. And it's harming black people when we're teaching them critical race theory. And of course, it's also harming white people. So I hope that as more of you guys are now more aware of this, you will hate critical race theory more, and hopefully you will do whatever is in your capacity to be praying more, to be praying for our politicians, to be praying for people who are speaking out against this issue, so that we can be more again informed and to stand against it, and to be truly, truly anti-racist. Thank you.
Used to emceeing. So as long as Sam's okay with it, I think we're going to have a little bit of question and answer time. There's no question that's stupid. I think.
You said if I'm okay with it?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I'm not okay with it.
Oh man, I should have put so much more in that intro. Anyway, so there will be question and answer time. There's no question that's stupid because, I mean, I don't know how many of you actually have heard of critical race theory, but we've all heard of a lot of these buzzwords as was mentioned earlier, and we just go, what are we dealing with here? So don't think that your question is too dumb to say out loud, and feel free, if you are learned, to ask those harder questions. I'm sure Sam can handle them. So.
No problem. Sorry.
My first question is, how do they figure that white people wrote the Bible when it was written by Jewish people that had dark skin? That were
Yeah.
Hebrews and Greeks? Just wondering.
So,
How would you answer
Sam,
that?
sorry, can you repeat the question just so we can get it on the video? So
Oh,
when they ask
sorry,
a question,
yeah.
can you just repeat it in the mic
Yeah.
and then answer it?
How
That'd
do
be
they
great.
explain away the fact that they're saying white supremacists wrote the Bible that we shouldn't follow, I guess,
Yeah.
when it's actually written by Hebrews and Greeks that were Jewish?
Yeah. So the question is, why is it that people are saying that white people wrote the Bible when, of course, it is Jews, dark-skinned people, or these darker-skinned people who wrote the Bible? Well, a critical race theorist, at least an informed critical race theorist, wouldn't say that exactly. What they would say is it is white supremacists, or it's white people who are creating their own, who are interpreting the Bible in a way that is white supremacist, right? So they would know that it was Jews who wrote it, but they would say that white people or Europeans have misinterpreted the Bible in such a way that what we think is actually biblical is not. So they would say it's actually Western Christianity, which is a big thing happening now. I didn't want to spend too much time on this, but how many of you are familiar with the movement of people deconstructing their faith? Yeah. That's all tied to critical race theory, because they're saying, well, again, what we think is good theology, what we think is biblical, is just white people manipulating us into thinking that the Bible is right on Christ being the only way to heaven, or on heaven and hell, or on the Bible being inspired, or the Bible being against same-sex marriage and things like that. It's all from critical race theory, saying that white people have abused the Bible to teach oppressive ideas. Is that helpful?
Yeah.
If you have a follow-up question, please go ahead.
I do have one more question.
Okay. All right. Okay. I thought maybe you had a follow-up question to what I just said.
Yeah, I just don't understand that because you have believers in China, you have believers in South America, so would they interpret it the same way? Like,
So there is another version of critical race theory, a more international version, a global version called post-colonialism, which says that it's the same idea as critical race theory, but what they're saying is Western nations, Europeans, white people have colonized people across the world. They colonized their mind. So they'll say that the Christianity in Europe, Africa, Asia is actually the Christianity that white supremacists have made them think is actually true when it's not. Now, of course, they're wrong about that, but that's how they work around that. Yeah. Sorry, I don't know if you heard. The question was, why would they say this, knowing that there are so many different people around the world who have the same faith, the same theology as Canadian or American Christians, and as I said, it's because they believe that the West has, or Western Christians have manipulated people around the world into thinking that our theology is good theology. Any more questions?
Yeah, Sam, do you have any thoughts on the Indian Act and colonization? And a lot of people say that, we've come to this country, we've colonized it, we've displaced the indigenous people, and so we owe them for that. Do you have any thoughts about that kind of thing?
Yeah, you're trying to cancel me, huh? Take the black people things, no, I'm just kidding. No, I will say that something that I'm studying the history more. I'm not as informed on that as I am with just Black Canadian history or whatever. I'm going to answer your question, but I just don't know as much on that as I want to. So, I did a conference once with an indigenous person, and my answers made her really angry. But whatever, I was right. She was wrong. That's okay. I'm gonna sound insensitive, but the reality is this. My people in Africa, I'm Fanti, that's my tribe in Ghana. We colonized one group, the group that was already there. And then we were also colonized. The whole history of the world is people colonize each other. It's reality, it's just reality. Here's the thing. Before white people or Europeans came to Canada or America, the indigenous people were colonizing each other as well. You don't hear that a lot. It's just a reality. So what I say to that is, of course, I don't want any injustice whatsoever, but powerful people tend to take over lesser people historically. That was true for Europeans taking over the land over here. Also, there was also a contract and a deal. Now, if they it sounds terrible, but if they got a bad deal, it was a deal. Now, of course, in some cases, it was actually just people robbing them. But the reality is that this is not new, unfortunately. Every part of the world, there's been colonization. So I say that, I know for many of them, they've suffered over that. But unfortunately, what's happening now with the government essentially creating a communism there in a lot of the reserves is harming them a lot more than anything else right now. So the airing of grievances is not really helping anything. It's okay, how do we how do we live as one nation instead of as two separate nations, which is actually hurting them more than it's hurting us. It's hurting all Canadians, but it's hurting them a lot more. So again, hopefully that's me answering your question.
That's good, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Black Lives Matters, how does that fit in?
Yeah, sorry, I know I didn't repeat your question, but the question was, how did Black Lives Matter fit into this? So Black Lives Matter so critical race theory is the ideology. Black Lives Matter is the biggest success of critical race theory, in that it is an organization, right? It's a movement, it's a political movement, and they are critical race theorists. Everything I said, right, to describe critical race theorists, they believe that. So Black Lives Matter is, the name is brilliant. Is probably the greatest name for any group in history. It is brilliant. Even me as a black person, when I describe why I hate Black Lives Matter, I have to say, I don't hate black people, right? That alone shows how brilliant the name is. Because if you go against them, everyone's like, well, wait, you don't believe Black Lives Matter? No, that's not what I'm saying. So it's very brilliant, it's very cunning, right? They know what they're doing with that phrase. But of course, when they say Black Lives Matter, they're not really saying Black Lives Matter. They're just saying that their agenda matters. Their communist, critical race theorist, leftist agenda matters. Because they are the most pro-abortion group probably in America and Canada. Because Planned Parenthood have actually donated to Black Lives Matter a lot. Now, Planned Parenthood kills a lot of black babies, right? They kill millions of black babies. They've killed since, I know in America, there have been around 20 million black babies killed since Roe v. Wade was passed. 20 million. So just so you know, there are about 40 million black Americans, and even the slaves who were forced into America, there are about only 200,000 slaves. Now, that's 200,000 more than it should be, right? It should be zero. Nevertheless, 200,000 slaves that ended up becoming millions of people, but 200,000 slaves, and then 20 million babies have been killed. Every year, there's about 300,000 or 400,000 black babies being killed in America, and Planned Parenthood kills the bulk of these babies. And yet, they support Black Lives Matter. So what does that say? Black Lives Matter is not really about Black Lives Matter at all. It's really about just their agenda being pushed.
Same question with wokeness.
Yeah, so wokeness is the same thing as critical race theory or feminism. So basically, feminism, LGBTQ ideas, critical race theory, they're all really intertwined. They're all different facets of the same thing, which is basically cultural Marxism. But what wokeness really means is, as I mentioned before, Karl Marx had the concept of class consciousness. And what he was saying there is that eventually, in his time anyways, eventually the proletariat, the oppressed class in society, would become conscious of their oppression. That right now, in his mind, Karl Marx's mind, they were being told that capitalism was good for all people. And in his mind, it was actually a lie. So he was saying that eventually the proletariat would, again, the poor people would come to realize that capitalism was actually bad for poor people. And then by being aware of that, by being woke to that, they would then have the revolution to end or topple the upper class. Wokeness is saying the same thing. They would say that me as a black person, I am not conscious of my oppression, that I am not awakened or woke to my oppression. So woke ideology is really just critical race theory, but a very specific point about how we need to be more woke, we need to be more aware of the oppression in our society.
Can I make a comment about our education system? As a retired teacher, I'm listening to the news. Ontario is going de-streamed in grade 9. De-streaming, from what I see, is because they use, every time they bring that up on the news, they quote somebody who says, my black son is being discriminated against.
Yeah.
Whereas I know as a teacher, it's not the school system that is discriminating, it's because of their family situation that is discriminating. I have not met any guidance counselor that would be discriminating. Their job and their calling is to help every student do the best that they can. So the grade 8 teachers are not saying to themselves, I want to oppress this black person at all, but they say that, and that's why we're just streaming. So everybody is treated the same, yeah. But what it does instead is those people who are weak in that subject area, like math, are left behind, and those who are very well in math are disinterested now because they don't get met. Either ends are not met. It's always the boring middle.
Yeah. If you don't mind, because I'm not sure if everyone here would know what de-streaming means, do you mind?
So de-streaming means instead of when you go from grade 8 and take basic...
applied academic.
Yeah, basic, applied, and academic, you are all in the same class. Just like you were in grade 8, But the difference is in grade 8, you will have a whole year to get back and circle around, so every child has an opportunity. But when you get to grade 9, you're one semester, and it was quad semesters recently, and that means you have to have it all done in a very short period of time, and you will be left behind if you're weak, and you'll be bored if you're strong.
Yeah. So just just to repeat what you were saying, is that Ontario is de-streaming, or basically is removing the academic or applied courses in math for students, and it's all under the idea that black people are being left behind with this, or they're being harmed with this. Well, this is another major problem. I know George Bush actually had a great phrase that I used to describe this. It's called the soft bigotry of low expectations, where they think that they're helping black people by doing this, but they're not at all. And I know also many teachers who've told me that they're also very concerned about how this will affect the people that they're trying to help. It gives you woke points, but it won't do anything else. It's not going to help black people at all.
We went through it already about 15 years ago, and after 4 years it was dropped because they realized it didn't work.
Yeah.
It left the poor people behind, the poor academically behind, and the stronger disinterested.
Yeah.
Just where do you see critical race theory most influencing the church right now?
It's the easiest one that seems so innocent that I've seen is the idea that we need to have multi-ethnic churches, or that we need to have diversity in our churches, or we need to have diversity, in pastors. So, for example, there are many pastors out there who will say, well, say Toronto, for example. I'm from Brampton, the Toronto area, and they will say that, well, Toronto has a lot of immigrants or immigrant population or black people. Therefore, we need to make sure that our churches look like our city, or that our elders should look like our city. Now, there's nothing wrong, of course, with a church looking like its city in terms of the diversity, or that the pastors would look like, again, the people in their city. The problem with that is this. I don't know if many of you are familiar with the seeker-sensitive movement, but it's very similar to that, in the idea that we need to attract certain kinds of people into our church. That's not how it should be. We're called to preach the gospel, to go to every neighborhood, to go to anywhere you can. Now, it doesn't matter what their colors are. Sin is sin, right? If you're a sinner, you're a sinner, right? But nothing wrong with going to every neighborhood and preaching the gospel. But the idea that you're failing if it's an all-white church is wrong, right? Or you're also not failing if it's an all-black church. Now, if it's intentionally so, sorry, I keep doing that. If it's intentionally so, then it's wrong. But if it just happens to be that you're preaching the gospel, but by the grace of God, God is bringing certain kinds of people into your church that is not going to give you woke points or give you diversity points, that's okay. But that idea is so prominent now that I know many pastors who've reached out to me saying, Sam, like, I'm being pressured here. Like, I'm being called racist because my church members I don't have a lot of black people in my church. Is that because I'm a racist? Or Sam, so I'll give you an example. Matt Chandler. I'll just mention his name. So I don't know how many of you know him, but he's a very popular preacher. And recently, but about 4 or 5 years ago, at a conference, he said he's very committed to hiring a black pastor. And this is what he said. He actually thought him saying this would be okay. He said, if there are 2 people he's going to hire elect as an elder in his church, and one of them is black, and the black pastor or the black candidate is a 7, is what he said, a 7, and then the white candidate is an 8 out of 10. He will pick the black candidate who's a 7. Well, that's actually racist, right? It's racist. But he said this thinking he's actually being an ally with black people. Well, I'd rather he be an ally with the word of God than an ally with black people, because the Bible has conditions. It has a criteria for who should be called, for what we should be looking for in an elder. skin color is not one of them, all right? And frankly, to be honest, if I'm a black person in his church and he comes to me saying, I want you to be an elder, I'm like, no, I don't want to be, because it seems like you care much more about my skin color than hopefully my character or my ability to teach the word of God. But this is very common in churches today. So critical race theory is very much in the church in many ways, but in a very obvious way, this is probably the one that is most obvious, which of course leads to other issues as well too within the church.
You said that you spoke with Rick Nichols. Do you think that Bill 67 will pass third reading and become law?
Can you just repeat the question?
Sorry, yeah. I was asked that since I've spoken to Rick Nichols, and do I believe that Bill 67 will become a law, that if it will be passed and become law?
Or what can we do?
Yeah. And then, no matter what I think, what can we do to ensure that it doesn't pass? It's tough to answer because, okay, so we have an election coming up, and that plays a big role in this. They're seeing pushback. It's not that much, but Jordan Peterson have been, and other people are speaking out against it, and it's scaring them now, and they're now a bit more leery of passing this. So it doesn't really benefit them to pass it anyways, but it might benefit them in that the media, because if they don't pass it now, the media will say, well, you're racist for not passing this. So it depends on what they think is more important. Is it offending conservatives and possibly losing even more votes than they already have? Or is it not being labeled racist, again, by the media? I don't know. If I had to bet, I'll probably say that it will pass, unfortunately. I think it's leaning more towards that. When only one MPP voted against it, I don't know if there's been enough pushback to completely stop it. I mean, the federal conservatives ended up voting for the conversion therapy ban, right? So nothing would surprise me. And yet again, there's hope that it could, it might not pass because of the election and the pushback. In terms of what do we do, call your MPP. Call them, because again, I'm not trying to embarrass him at all. He's been very humble about it. But Rick Nichols didn't know what critical race theory is. He didn't know what equity means. He didn't know what anti-racism means. I guarantee you, by you guys being in this room, and hopefully I'm not saying this out of pride, is that I guarantee you by hearing what I'm saying, you know more than the average politician on critical race theory. Trust me, I have friends, within politics, and I remember when I heard about them not being aware of what this bill really is, my friend who's in politics said, Sam, you'd be surprised how many people in politics have no idea what they're doing. And so just calling them and talking to them, you will do a lot more than you think you might. And then also, just of course, pray about this, because I think, me personally, I don't pray enough. I oftentimes, when I hear about, so if I didn't know about Rick Nichols actually not knowing what he was voting for, I would think, look at these guys, they're all just critical race theorists, and they, they're against our values. Sometimes they just don't know. So just praying that God would make them more informed through our calls and prayers, and just even pressuring the schools to know that, look, we are paying attention to what they're teaching. These things are more helpful than we think.
We'll take one more.
Okay. By the way, if any of you disagree with me, please be okay to challenge me. You'd be wrong, but it's okay. And I have a blog. I can just call you out as well, too. But no, I'm just kidding. But no, feel free, please, to ask me a challenging question. It's okay. No, not you. No, I'm kidding. No problem.
What's your opinion on the cancel culture and tearing down statues and changing names of buildings instead of teaching the dirty history and make it change that way?
Yeah. It's dangerous. It's very dangerous. Sorry, the question was, what do I think? I'm really bad at this. What do I think about cancel culture? Which, instead of teaching the dirty history of some of our heroes or leaders in the past. They're just trying to erase them from history. One of the things I've said is during the 2020 riots and some of the protests, when they were tearing down statues and things like that, it struck me that a lot of the people who are doing this are pro-abortion. Many of the women have killed their babies, they've murdered their babies. By the grace of God, say if 10 years from now, we end abortion finally. Hopefully, we end it tomorrow. But let's just say 10 years from now, when we end this, should these women be canceled? Of course not. Of course not. But yet, they think that other people who frankly have done less than they have, right? I'm not trying to, I know abortion is very common in our country, and I know that there's probably people here who've had an abortion, and if you've repented, by the grace of God, you're free, right? So I'm not saying this to shame anybody here. Yet, of course, murdering someone is worse than being racist. So yet you have many people who are guilty of murder who think that people who are racist or who were racist or said things that could be perceived as racist should be canceled. That is, of course, very harmful to our society. And now, of course, you can have the reverse happening, where people just want to cancel their own rivals or enemies going forward. I don't want conservatives canceling leftists. I want us to convince them that they're wrong, right? I want Christians not to cancel unbelievers. I want us to convince them to believe the gospel, right? And this is, of course, very dangerous. And as you said, removing dirty history isn't good. I want to learn from people who have failed in certain ways so I can learn not to repeat it myself. But if you cancel people, then you can't have that opportunity to learn. And frankly, I'm very grateful that the Bible speaks. I will never be able to fathom that God in his grace would say that David was a man after his own heart when this man was an adulterer and a murderer, right? God didn't cancel him, so who am I to cancel anybody, So, so that's what I would say to that.
And Samuel, where can they find you online? Can you just give your website, your blog, and just so that those taking notes can find and follow you?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, you can find me at slowtowrite.com. Sorry?
Which right?
Oh, yeah, it's writing, WRITE, slowtowrite.com. And, it's taken from James 1:19. Everyone should be slow to anger, quick to listen, and slow to speak. And I'm trying to emulate that, hopefully, in my writing. They can find me on social media, too. Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, @slowtowrite. And I cause a bit of trouble sometimes on social media, so. Yeah. Thank you for having me, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.